President Zelensky of Ukraine is set to address the U.S. Senate via video link later today. Obviously, the focus is on Ukraine's need for continued U.S. military aid to fight Russia. The Biden administration previously requested Congress approve a $106 billion aid package for Ukraine, Israel, and U.S. border security, which was rejected by the Republican-controlled House. Now, despite over $110 billion in aid provided since Russia's invasion last February of 2022, actually, no new financial aid has been approved since Republicans took control of the House back in January of this year. Biden's budget director, Shalanda Young, expressed concerns in a letter to the Republican House and House Speaker Mike Johnson that a halt in U.S. military aid could significantly weaken Ukraine's military efforts against Russia. Now, the war in Ukraine is often misunderstood in its global impact, particularly in the U.S. and Europe. A common perception is that it's a regional dispute, leading many to question the necessity of international involvement, especially when faced with pressing domestic concerns in both Europe and the United States. This view often trivializes the territorial disputes, such as, do Americans really care whether Berdyansk should be Ukrainian or Russia, or suggesting that Ukraine simply could make the concessions necessary to resolve the conflict. This argument of, I'm just against people dying. I mean, 90% of Americans probably didn't know Kyiv was the capital of Ukraine, and many more mispronounced it. However, this idea that it is only a regional conflict isn't just held by those that are uninformed or just generally don't care about the global stability that many of us live in happily. It extends to individuals who have confidence in NATO's assurances of defending member territories. All of those NATO members believe that this is the key tenet, the core tenet of the NATO treaty. This belief leads to the misconception that areas outside of NATO's jurisdiction are less important, things like Ukraine specifically, but also other areas across the globe, including possibly Taiwan. And this creates what is called a moral hazard. Now, a moral hazard is when you don't protect yourself from the risk because you really don't bear the brunt of the consequences. NATO's Article 5, which calls for the collective defense of all of its members, has contributed to a problematic stance in dealing with Russia's aggression. By strictly committing to defend only its member states, only NATO states, NATO may inadvertently signal that aggressive actions outside of the borders of NATO is tolerable. This leads to a situation where NATO member countries and its allies don't feel compelled to react to aggression or conflicts that don't directly threaten NATO territory. The moral hazard here is a reduced motivation to proactively address security threats that are geographically close but technically outside of the NATO defense umbrella. Russia is aware of this, and they exploit it, which is why you see them attack territories that are not a part of NATO and then constantly whine about NATO expansion, because when a country joins NATO, it comes off the board for potential future Russia expansion. Secondly, the association of Article 5 with the prospect of nuclear war against Russia raises the threshold for intervention to an impractical level. If NATO countries perceive that confronting Russian aggression might lead to a nuclear conflict, they are reluctant to take any action, and that escalates the situation. We've confronted countries with have nuclear weapons before, and it never was an issue, and now suddenly it is. This creates a moral hazard where Russia, who understands completely the reluctance of NATO members to do anything because Russia has nuclear weapons. It's why Russia continues to hammer that nuclear weapons button that repeats that they have them over and over, and it emboldens Russia to escalate the conflicts that it is fighting, whether it's Georgia or Ukraine, to a level that is right up to the threshold that would trigger a NATO response, but not past that. NATO then becomes paralyzed in decision-making, being overly cautious to avoid a nuclear escalation. And that's exactly what we're seeing in Ukraine right now. In the US, France, and the United Kingdom, there is this viewpoint that questions the logic of risking nuclear confrontation over a country like Estonia. The argument is made for yielding to Russian demands, giving Russia what it wants as long as peace is maintained. Again, those irritating people that are just like, I just don't want people to die. That's a utopian world that doesn't exist. You need to grow up. However, it's crucial to recognize that Russian aggression may not always manifest in military action. It may not be something that is bullets being fired at each other. It may be things like subtle tactics and strategies like economic pressure, which Russia does on Ukraine's border, political subversion, which we see Russia do all over the place, using private military companies so Russia keeps its hands off of the dirty deeds, such as in Syria, covert military actions and psychological operations also, all things Russia has used before. To those that downplay the importance of supporting Ukraine, especially those in Europe, which is somewhat baffling, you don't understand the consequences here. The experience of war, that death and destruction seems far removed from your lives, but it really isn't. Assuming that such horrors are distant and cannot affect your own region or your country is a dangerous oversight, as conflict in Europe is a current and stark example of how quickly stability can be upended. There are people still alive today that fought in World War II, for hell's sake. Ukraine is not just a regional conflict, but a critical geopolitical issue with far-reaching implications. I could hammer on Taiwan here, talking about China's just kind of watching to see what happens. The West's response, or lack thereof, to Russian aggression sets a precedence for international relations and security. It's a matter of understanding the broader consequences of an action and the moral responsibility of supporting nations that face aggression from countries that have very nefarious means and outcomes and wishes. Our inaction grants the authority of countries with nuclear weapons to do whatever and take whatever, which means more countries will seek nuclear weapons. Taiwan, Japan, and South Korea most certainly will, if they see that no one's going to help them out in the face of a China that potentially could become aggressive. The Baltic nations, as well as other Eastern European nations, and I don't blame them. If the only defense here is nuclear weapons because that is what we are signaling by taking an action against Russia, they absolutely will develop them themselves, and this could lead to preemptive strikes across the board and a massive destabilizing effect that will get Americans, Brits, and French killed. We cannot be scared of the bully because we never used to be. And we need to do something about Russia and support Ukraine now before this explodes into something that becomes very, very difficult to manage and a lot more people, especially Americans, get killed.